guess I'll start by saying thank you again. Thank you so much for inviting me on these kind of series of interviews. I'm really excited to see them and watch them all because I think it's an absolutely fantastic initiative from the students of the CES. And I'm really pleased that I was one of the people invited. I can give a little bit of a maybe different perspective to the majority of the CES in that I work on animal culture, especially mostly on birds. So my research is largely focused on understanding how new behaviors arise in animal societies, how they spread through social networks, and how they establish as new cultural traditions, focusing on foraging behavior, but I've done a little bit also on vocal communication. And then more recently, I've also been increasingly interested in how cultures might change in animal groups in response to social drivers like turnover or immigration rate, and environmental drivers like environmental change and urbanization and anthropogenic change. And so my work has been looking mainly in two different avian systems, although I've worked on a few others as well. The great tit, which is a European Asian small passerine bird that's a very successful garden bird found across Europe, doing very nicely under the anthropogenic change, and the sulphur-crested cockatoo in Australia, which is at the other end of the life history spectrum. It's very long-lived, slow breeding, large-brained, large parrot, but has also been very successful at adapting to anthropogenic change like urbanization.
So just to recap, you are working with the great tits as part of your research fellowship at the University of Zurich, is that right?
Well, my research fellowship at the University of Zurich is actually, believe it or not, focused on Australian parrots. It's this broader question of using urban animals, or the study of urban animals, to try and understand what effect these rapid environmental changes might have on animal cultures and how animal cultures might help them for populations to exhibit behavioral adaptations to novel environments. So in that research grant, we sort of start with this premise that cities are hotspot. We know cities are hotspots for human culture and cultural change, but they might also be hotspots for animal innovation, animal culture, and cultural change, and similarly might be driving new adaptive behaviors in these species as well. The great tits we also do, but not part of this specific research grant. And there we've really used them as an experimental system because they're just so amenable to behavioral experiments in captive and wild. And we can use them to ask fundamental questions about cultural processes. For example, some of the work of my postdoc, Michael Cimento, has looked at how social turnover might increase the rate of cultural evolution, and how immigrants, when they move between different environments, might exhibit different learning biases that will then change the cultures of the groups they move into.
And coming back to the Australian cockatoos.
Yeah.
You were mentioning something about what you have found in their response to the rapidly changing environment, induced by human urbanization. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so cockatoos are this fascinating paradox. They are basically feathered primates. This species of cockatoo doesn't become sexually mature till it's 7 years old, so a really long juvenile period. They only ever had one chick a year. The majority of the population doesn't breed in any given year, and they live for decades. We're not even sure how long, but there's a few famous zoo cases where they've lived for over 100 years. We also know that they have relative brain sizes on par with primates, and absolute numbers of neurons on par with primates like macaques or other large-brained birds like ravens. So these are large, slow-breeding, large-brained birds, sort of like the elephant or the primate of the brain world. And yet they have been incredibly successful at adapting to what in Australia has been rapid change since European settlement. And this is only over a few generations because they're so long-lived as well. So the way they've been able to do this, it seems, from our work, has been through flexibility. And this behavioral flexibility has come from a high degree of innovativeness at the individual level and connected but modular networks that allow for the rapid spread of new information over sometimes whole city scales in a matter of weeks. So that seems to be a way that they're able to exhibit population level kind of changes in behavior that are adapted to what can be very fast changes in the urban environment, because as we know, urban environments aren't just novel, they also change when the local government decides to change how bins are collected or they decide to plant new street trees. You can have really widespread and very fast changes in the resource landscape that they have to deal with.
I'm not sure how wide your study area is in Australia, but do you see very distinct cultural traditions in that case?
So one thing we do see is that innovations will rise and spread at the local scale. So we'll end up with different cultural traditions in different areas that have risen through these processes. What we don't tend to see as much as perhaps in primate studies is existing cultural differences between areas. It might be that we're not looking over a large enough scale. So our study site is the east coast of Australia, centred around Sydney. So we're talking sort of 100 kilometres north to south, which, as the cockatoo flies, is within their potential dispersal distance. Although that said, in cities, they don't tend to move as much as they do outside of cities, probably promoting this local sort of clustering of behavioural variation. But we do have some really great examples of new innovations that have emerged and then spread through social networks and established in different populations or different roosting groups around the city. So the first one we looked at was bin opening behavior. So this is where birds will lift and open the lids of household bins that people put on the street on bin day. It's actually cognitively appears to be very difficult. It's probably also physically difficult for the birds. It seems to take them months to learn how to open a bin, and it's more of trial and error at multiple stages. But we also have really good evidence that it's socially learned and spreads through social networks. It then spreads at a geographic scale. So as birds disperse, they carry it into new groups, and it's still spreading as we speak. But is clustered to one region of the city, despite the fact that bins are ubiquitous across the entirety of Australia. So that in itself is good evidence that it's a cultural process. It's established as a local culture. And one interesting side note to that study is that we have started to see local differences in the way they open bins. So they are converging, let's say, or they're spreading new information that's clearly adaptive, accessing pizza and bread and pasta from bins and getting all those carbohydrates. But we are seeing cultural variation in the sort of details of how they go about these new foraging techniques.
Are these cultural variations relegated to certain localities, or is it just between individuals instead?
So cockatoos have a society which is quite common in the bird world, but it might not be something that people are so familiar outside of ornithology. They sleep in communal roosts. So hundreds to maybe 1,000 birds will sleep in a couple, 3 or 4 trees. And those roost sites are also likely traditional and persist over decades. So one individual will stay at a roost for many, many years, and they spend most of their life in that roost. There's another roost, maybe in the city 2-3 kilometers away, another way that way. So you basically have the city divided up, or whatever environment they're living in, from these roosting groups. Most of the interactions occur within that roost. So there's a very strict, clear dominance hierarchy, for example, in the roost itself. But individuals also interact with those from other roosts, potentially when they're out foraging, or we also see they will kind of go on mini holidays where they sleep at other roosts for a few nights and then they come back to their usual one. So when we examine the spread of information or new innovation, you tend to see that this forms modular networks. So the information will spread potentially very rapidly, slowly, depending on how difficult it is to learn, through a roost, because they share a home range. There's a lot of potential for information transfer. They're all sleeping in the same place at night, but they're splitting up in fission flocks during the day. But then it will also spread between roosts through either contact with these moving individuals or via more permanent dispersal that they undertake when they move from one roost to another. So it's almost a sort of meta-population type of dynamic where you have these different levels of social organization, the social network within the roost, but then this wider social landscape that they live in. We are still working on this, but it seems like this sort of social organization leads to partially connected networks where you both have the potential for very rapid spread of information within groups and then between groups. But the spread of information between groups is still rare enough to allow for the emergence of variation between groups. And interestingly, these sort of partially connected social networks in the human literature have been hypothesized to be potentially very important for complex culture because it allows for both the spread of information at the wider level, but also these sorts of minor variations, which can then lead to recombination later on and the emergence of more complex traits. So we see something somewhat similar in the cockatoo world.
Wow, I didn't realize that because I was just reminded of the study with primates. I think they were chimpanzees and their leaf cultures. And I remember reading about how migrants from one group to another group, they take their culture with them, but it does not persist in that new group.
So in the cockatoos, we see very little evidence. Not saying we won't see evidence because we're still doing those experiments, but at present we see very little evidence for strong conformity effects like you see in primates, where an individual might even abandon adaptive behavior to sort of fit in with the group. That doesn't seem to happen in cockatoos, and I think that's maybe part of the reason why you get this intergroup transmission of behavior much more rapidly and easily than in something like a chimpanzee. Interestingly, in great tits, we do see conformity in behavior, but it appears to be a means to gaining a sort of shortcut to gaining the most adaptive or beneficial behavior quickly. So it's something that immigrants will engage in, for example, to quickly gain an idea of what the best local knowledge is. And there's no, let's say, social consequence for not being conformist, like there's been hypothesized to be in humans, for example. It's more like they're using these social learning biases or rules as ways to gain good behavior quickly.
Speaking of social learning biases, do you see a lot of a varied use of different social learning strategies in either great tits and or the cockatoos?
Absolutely, and that's been something we've worked on through a bunch of experiments in the great tits particularly, but we also see it in the cockatoos. So for sure, we see evidence of social learning biases or strategies, or whatever you want to call them, in animals. And there's a whole bunch of varied strategies that people have shown across different species of animals. In the case of my study species, in the great tits, they show updating of their biases depending on the context, which I think is really fascinating. So when in a kind of, let's say, normal situation, they'll exhibit a conformist bias. So they'll copy the majority behavior that they observe, and they sort of lose that over time as they gain more personal experience, as you'd expect, but it still does influence the way in which they learn. And this is probably, like I said, a shortcut to gaining the best local adaptive knowledge for a species that can move through the landscape quite a lot and engage with lots of other individuals, and where the microhabitats can be very different, even in the space of one woodland. That said, when the environment changes, they won't change in their bias. They'll continue to be conformist, even when this leads to a slower population level shift in the behavior in response to the environment. But when the individual is moved between different environments, then they'll change to using a payoff biased learning. So they'll preferentially adopt the resident behavior, but only if the resident behavior gives a higher payoff than the behavior they learned, and if the environment they move into is different from the one they were in. So it seems like what they're able to do is update the way they learn depending on these sort of cues, these social cues, these environmental cues, which makes a lot of sense for a species where they're basically absorbing as much information as they can to survive the winter, where starvation is the main source of mortality. And, they haven't got time to sort of stick around, and where the social groups are very fluid. So they also aren't facing these sorts of social types of pressures that might happen more in structured societies, like in human societies. In cockatoos, we see age differences, or let's say differences across age in the learning biases they use. So in young cockatoos, so in those that are less than 7 years old, they effectively look like adults. They're sort of teenage cockatoos. They're independent of their parents after about 1 year, and they just hang around being teenagers till they're about 8 years old, and then they become sexually mature. So in that period, we see they appear to be quite conformist, at least when learning about new food, which did surprise us because we thought, well, young individuals will be less conformist, but no, that's not the case. While adults are more unbiased in the way they learn, although we haven't tested for all forms of learning biases in the cockatoos. We're not sure why, but it might be that this reflects the sort of thing we see in human children as well, where they're quite conservative about food in particular, until they've gained kind of a lot of personal experience when they age. So that's just the two examples of the ones in the species we study. And I think that what's becoming clear in the animal world is that the way in which animals engage in social learning is variable, but also can change depending on the sort of input that they're receiving. So they're not necessarily fixed evolved biases, but they might be more related to something like attention. And so they're more context or state dependent.
Do you also see something like an effect of personality in social learning biases in cockatoos or great tits? Because you talked about age as a factor. What about within age between individual variation?
Yeah, I think the biggest variation we observe is depending on rank. And this is perhaps what you'd expect, because if you're a subdominant individual, then your options are more limited than if you're a dominant individual. And this does seem to affect learning. What we also see is a choice of whether or not they engage in learning at all can be dependent on state and individual differences. So scrounging is ubiquitous in the animal kingdom. Some might say in humans as well, where you steal the food or take the scraps of somebody else's meal rather than learning how to do it yourself. And this is something we see in every species that I've studied. And there seems to be quite strong individual variation in whether animals will engage in scrounging behavior or engage in learning. And that's often consistent across the context as well.
Is that also consistent over time for the individual?
Yeah. So you get kind of a bimodal population, those that learn and those that scrounge, which is a little bit different to some of the more classic social learning models where we might think of social learning as scrounging and asocial learning as producing. But in this case, we have three types of individuals. We have innovators, we have social learners, and we have those that do neither, but just try to steal the leftovers.
Thinking about how you actually study all of this. So you're talking about the cockatoos and you're studying them, I guess, in their natural environment, which is an urbanized environment. How do you go around and observe I mean, at random times? Do you just have to follow them around all day long? What is the methodology you employ to study them?
So for the cockatoos, we use a combination of methodologies. So if we're doing intensive behavioral studies or experiments, we tend to work at the roost. What's quite nice is that in urban areas, the roosts tend to be in old parks because they really want big old trees to roost in. So they often also forage to some extent, or at least sleep and just hang around in those parks. So we can go to those parks, we habituate them. They are not hard to habituate in the urban areas because people feed them anyway. And then we tend to do things like put paint marks on them. We also glue on or fit harnesses for more active, like GPS tracking. We take genetic samples so we can look at kinship. And then we mostly do our work in the park. The way we follow them outside into the wider urban area is not on foot like you might a chimpanzee, because I'm not sure whether it's more difficult, but it's certainly still also difficult to follow something on foot around a peak hour traffic city, large city. We instead tend to employ two different techniques. So, like I said, we'll use a lot of GPS tracking. So we'll do remote observations through those techniques. And then we use a lot of citizen science as well. So we have an app called Big City Birds, and people report when they see our birds to us. They can also report behaviors like bin opening behavior or other innovations they've observed. And we're able to get that sort of landscape level picture through the many eyes of the public. And that's a big advantage to working in more urban areas, is that you have citizen scientists, potentially hundreds of thousands of them, out there willing to do observations on your study species.
And I assume you get a lot of data through that. There are a lot of people willing to do that.
Yes, it's important to pick a species that people find interesting. So we have an advantage with the cockatoos that a lot of people love them, a lot of people hate them, but there aren't many people who don't care at all. So we have some sort of opinion either way, which makes them more likely to engage in research about them. And they're a big, obvious species that's not particularly scared of humans. So they're easy to observe and they come very close. A lot of people in Australia also feed them by hand. So we'll give them nuts off their balcony, for example. And if they engage in our citizen science, then we can also get quite close observations of the birds as we do that. And we find that the cockatoos are very good at also learning which people feed them and when. So they're also adjusting their routines based off that human behavior. So they'll, for example, they will sleep all together in the park, and then in the more urban areas, they'll often go out to hunt for balconies between the hours of 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. Then in the middle of the day, they'll use resources like fig trees or oak trees, and then you'll see them heading back out to the balconies at about 5 to 6 p.m. So they're very closely matching when people are home and adjusting their behavior to sort of be complementary to the flow of human movement around the city and over time. So yeah, that's the advantage of working in the city. We also try to engage in as much sort of remote data collection as we can. So this is something we've done a lot with, particularly in the Great Tits, is use puzzle boxes, smart puzzle boxes that will interface with the birds and be based off either, so for example, RFID tags on the birds or barcodes sometimes, or other individual marking or BLE tags that we're using now. So we can collect a lot of our data without us having to be there with physical eyes on the animals.
That's a sentence I never thought I would hear, hunting for balconies.
No, I shouldn't say hunting for balconies because they know exactly where they are. I should say heading out on their morning foraging commute, which often goes balcony to balcony. And then they'll head to the fig trees once the people have all gone to work.
I'm curious, why do they hate the cockatoos?
So I was discussing this with a local birdwatching group just the other week, and the conclusion we came to was that smart animals and smart people restricted in small spaces, forced to interact with each other, is sometimes a recipe for conflict. So the cockatoos are very smart and very happy to engage in a lot of human structures. They're also very large and chewy. They need to exercise their bills to wear down the bills. So they will engage in chewing on wooden balconies. They'll push things off balconies. I mean, you just need to Google YouTube videos of cockatoos to see them engaged in all sorts of havoc, from pushing pot plants off balconies to stripping people's windows or opening Tupperware containers they leave outside and stealing their food. We see these sorts of innovative behaviors are often occasionally lead to conflict, because there'll be a way to access resources that humans don't necessarily want animals to access. And this conflict then leads for people to hate them. They're also very loud. If there's 100 of them squawking next to your house, you might feel like your love for them is waning a little bit. But what we find is that, by and large, people will say to us, cockatoos, geez, they're assholes, but you've got to love them. They've just got so much charisma. So it's can be a love-hate within the same person, even some of the time. They understand that they're just doing what a cockatoo does. It's just unfortunate that what they often do is strip your house and steal all your fruit from your fruit trees. But, you've got to love them for doing it because they've got so much character.
Sound a bit like seagulls, but with charisma. Because, up here in the UK, seagulls are quite hated.
I would say seagulls have charisma, but I may be a little bit biased. But yeah, it's a similar sort of problem. And it's a problem which is another dimension to our work, because it's human-wildlife conflict in urban areas is a massive issue around the world. And it's one that we have to try and manage really carefully, because on the one hand, we really want more biodiversity in cities. That cities are the fastest growing habitat that on the globe, unfortunately. And so animals are starting to adapt to that new habitat. And we want to encourage that because we want to preserve animal populations. And it's no longer enough to preserve animal populations in closed off wildernesses. We have to also conserve and preserve animal populations in human modified environments if we're going to have any sort of sustained biodiversity. But on the other hand, humans also live in cities in large numbers. And so that mix can be quite difficult to manage. And what we see in many vertebrate species is that one of the main predictors of urban adaptation in animals is brain size. So it's smart animals which are often moving into our cities, and they're adapting to our cities through these sorts of behavioral adaptations, which could be at the individual level, but I would argue are very often cultural adaptations. And those are behaviors which are often going to be sources of conflict. Opening bins, making a mess with the rubbish. Some other innovations that cockatoos engage in is, for example, in some parts of Sydney, they've learned to unzip the backpacks of school kids as they walk into class, or they leave their bags outside and steal their lunches. Smart, interesting, cool, but not great if you're that kid who now no longer has a lunch. But we also see raccoons, open bins. Wild boar have started to move into cities and do these sorts of behaviors as well. Feral dogs in India, macaques in Southeast Asia can be a real problem in urban areas. Hyenas and vervet monkeys in West and Southern Africa can also lead to urban conflict through bin raiding behavior, house raiding behavior, or direct stealing of food from people like the seagulls do in the UK. So these are all fascinating behaviors, but they all lead to conflict, and there's something that we need to learn how to manage in these species. And I would argue that part of the way we learn how to learn about them and understand them is through the study of cultural evolution, understanding how these new behaviors are rising and spreading in populations and changing over time, and how we could potentially sort of either predict them or manage them.
So speaking of this relationship with, humans, so the interactions between humans and cockatoos, stepping back a bit, as you are studying non-human animals, and there aren't that many of them in the Cultural Evolution Society. What is your own view on what culture is?
So I'm a zoologist and an evolutionary ecologist, I would call myself, but also I study cultural evolution. And I think that I try to take a very functional approach to these sorts of definitions. I want something that we can test and go out into the field and test in a wide range of species, something that's as widely as applicable as possible. So my definition of culture would be really stripped back, and it would reflect the sort of work by, say, Hal Whitehead and Hoppert and Leyland had a similar definition, where culture is defined as a behavior that's at least partially socially learned through interaction between individuals, spreads in populations through social transmission, and is persistent over time. And I think that persistence over time is actually one of the interesting things, because does this mean over generations? Does this mean over years? But that's sort of a question of how long is a piece of string. For me, when you go down to the fundamentals, we're looking for behaviors which are socially learned and spread through social networks, so they exist on the substrate of the social network. So we can identify them through experiments, looking at the mechanisms of learning, but also looking at the uptake of the behavior in the population and variation across groups, for example, in disconnected populations. So that's what I would define as culture. Where it gets a little bit muddy is sometimes has been with this idea of whether a tradition is a culture. For me, I call everything a sort of cultural trait. I'm talking about cultural transmission, and I don't worry too much about that. But I'm also open to the idea that, okay, maybe you want to call what I'm talking about a tradition, and a culture is more like a package of co-occurring traditions in a population. I don't mind. What I think is really important to understand in terms of animal ecology is both what behaviors are maintained through cultural transmission and social learning, and this process of cultural inheritance. Behaviors are passed via social learning down generations of individuals, because we're becoming increasingly aware that actually large parts of animal repertoires can be culturally inherited, everything from migration routes to calls and song to foraging behavior to anti-predator behavior. And these can all be really important for the life history of individuals. So if we don't understand what's culturally inherited versus what isn't, then we might not be able to predict what behavior will shift rapidly within generations and what behavior is vulnerable to extinction if, for example, we remove individuals from populations or translocate them or break age structures in populations. So it's a little bit of a different perspective to some of the CES, but I think by and large, we are coming to agreement. I think we have a lot more in common than we do differences in terms of how we see culture as cultural evolutionists across whatever system we study.
The last question I would like to ask you is, what would you say about CES? Why should people join CES? How has your time at CES been? And like you said, your disagreements about culture have been, getting resolved. How has your overall experience been in the Cultural Evolution Society?
I would say that the Cultural Evolution Society is just a really fantastic organization. I am obviously a member of a few different societies because we all have different prongs to our research. For example, I'm a member of the Behavioral Ecology Society and the Animal Behavior Society as well. And those are both great organizations. But what I think makes CES different is just how interdisciplinary it is. I've never been part of an organization where in the one conference that you go to, you can go to one session on archaeology, one on economics, one on anthropology, one on primatology, one on animal vocalizations, or one on birdsong. And this for me is just really exciting. We tend to get so siloed in one area that we work in because those are the colleagues that we interact with day to day, the people in our lab group, etc., the people we publish with most of the time. But CES takes a common question and often common methodologies and then breaks that across all these different fields of research and brings those people together to talk. As we know, as people who work on cultural evolution, one of the most common ways in which we see cultural evolution is through recombination, right? Of increasing complexity of culture. It's through bringing different ideas together and then recombining them in new ways. And I think that's what the Cultural Evolution Society does. Not to get too maudlin, but it gives that opportunity for people to interact across different areas. And I first had contact with CES when they invited me to give a talk in, I think it was the conference in Phoenix a few years back. And I gave my usual bird talk and I thought, who's going to be interested in this? And then, by the end of the conference, I was talking to economists and finding commonalities in the methods that we use. Social networks are the same across whatever species you study. And talking to archaeologists and then just thinking, this is great. I want more of this. So I've been doing my bit to try and convince animal ecologists working on animal behavior and social learning in animal behavior to come over more towards CES. And I think that our little section of work on animals is growing and becoming, I think, really core. And that's exciting as well, because I think as well as learning something from people who work on humans, we can also give something back that they might be able to learn from the sort of approaches we take in, to animal experiments or to animal study as well. Yeah.
That's an excellent pitch.
That's my pitch. Join the Cultural Evolution Society. Join
Hopefully
us.
this gets more bird behaviorists joining our society.
Well, to kind of finish my pitch, I would say to the bird people out there and to the cultural evolution people, bird song is one of the best examples we have of cultural evolution. We've had 150 years plus of excellent research around the world on bird song, looking specifically at cultural evolution, cumulative culture in birdsong, dialects across areas, change within individuals towards increasing complexity, drift, changes towards simplicity in small declining populations and on island colonizations, for example. And this work has often been really quite separate to the work of cultural evolution. But I think that's, a real pity, because there's so much crosstalk that can happen there. And so much that an area like that, where there's been really intensive study of this kind of one cultural domain, so much that can sort of be used to inform studies in both humans and other animals. So yeah, that's just one example of a work in birds, but where actually cultural evolution is actually fundamental to that research field. So, yeah.
That is true. Bird song. Well, with that, I guess we can wrap it up.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you
but
so much
no time for that. We've been focused on other questions. Sorry, I interrupted you.
I just want to thank you for doing this, and I think it's been very insightful to hear from someone not working on humans for a change. So yeah, thank you for that, Lucy.
No, thank you. I really enjoyed it.